March 16th, 1970. The House of God Pentecostal Church in Detroit stood empty, except for one man. Marvin Gaye knelt at the altar, his knees pressed against the cold wooden floor, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. 7 hours earlier, Tammy Terrell had died in a Philadelphia hospital. Brain tumor, 24 years old. Gone. "Where were you?" Marvin whispered to the darkness above the pulpit. His voice cracked. "Where the hell were you when she needed you?" The silence that answered him was the same silence that had been growing in his chest for months. But tonight, for the first time, Marvin let it consume him completely. This was the moment Marvin Gaye's faith died. Not all at once, but like Tammy herself had died, slowly in pieces, leaving behind questions that would torment him for the rest of his life. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, the son of a Pentecostal minister, asking God questions his father had taught him never to ask. Questions that could damn a man's soul. Questions that revealed the kind of doubt his father had spent decades trying to beat out of him. Marvin had been raised in the house of God under the iron fist of Marvin Gaye Sr., a man who preached love on Sundays and practiced cruelty the other 6 days. Every morning before school, young Marvin recited Bible verses while his father scrutinized his reverence. Every evening he knelt and prayed for forgiveness for sins he hadn't committed. And when those prayers weren't fervent enough, when his voice didn't carry the proper, trembling fear of the Lord, the beatings would come. The leather belt, the wooden paddle, sometimes just the back of a heavy hand. "God sees everything," his father would say, "and he doesn't like what he sees in you, boy." But young Marvin had believed anyway. Had to believe. Because if God wasn't real, if God wasn't watching, if God wasn't keeping some cosmic score of suffering and redemption, then the pain meant nothing. The fear meant nothing. His entire childhood became meaningless brutality inflicted by a man who claimed to speak for heaven. So he'd sung in the church choir with everything he had, let his voice soar toward the rafters every Sunday morning, hoping God was listening somewhere beyond the ceiling, hoping God would see past the sin his father claimed lived in his heart and recognize something worth saving, something pure. Music became his prayer. Soul became his sanctuary. When other children were outside playing, Marvin was inside practicing scales, perfecting his vibrato, learning to make his voice do things that seemed almost supernatural. His mother, Alberta, would sit in the back of the sanctuary during choir practice, tears streaming down her face as she listened to her son sing. She never said it out loud, but Marvin could see it in her eyes. This boy had a gift that came from somewhere holy. This voice was bigger than their small church, bigger than Detroit, bigger than anything they could understand. When Berry Gordy signed him to Motown in 1961, Marvin saw it as God's answer. Finally, a way to use his voice for something beautiful. The secular world might have been full of temptation, but Marvin convinced himself he could stay clean. But the music industry was a different kind of church, with different rules and different sins. And slowly, Marvin began to drift. The drinking started first, just wine to calm his nerves before performances. Then came the marijuana, passed around Motown studios like communion bread. Then the women, so many beautiful women throwing themselves at the smooth romantic singer with the golden voice and the sad eyes. Each compromise felt small at the time. Each step away from his father's rigid doctrine felt like freedom, like finally being able to breathe. But late at night, alone in hotel rooms across America, lying in beds that weren't his own, Marvin would feel something else entirely. Guilt. Deep, crushing guilt that made it hard to breathe. Shame that seemed to seep into his bones and stay there. His father's voice would echo in his head like a broken record. God sees everything, boy, and he doesn't like what he sees in you. By 1967, when Marvin began recording duets with Tammy Terrell, the war in his soul had reached a terrible stalemate. He was successful, wealthy, admired by millions of fans who had no idea about the darkness that followed him everywhere. But success couldn't silence the voices. Wealth couldn't fill the growing emptiness. And admiration from strangers couldn't replace the love and approval he'd never received from the man who was supposed to represent God on earth. Tammy changed everything. Not romantically. They were never lovers. despite what fans and journalists believed. But spiritually, emotionally, she became something he'd never had before. A friend who understood the weight of carrying other people's expectations while slowly losing yourself in the process. Sometimes I think God put us here just to suffer, Tammy told him once during a break between recording sessions. They were sitting in Studio A at Hitsville, sharing a cigarette, and her words cut through the artificial sweetness of their latest duet like a knife through silk. Don't say that, Marvin replied automatically, the response programmed into him by decades of his father's sermons and Sunday school lessons. Why not? Tammy's eyes were tired, older than her 22 years. Look around, Marvin. Really look. Vietnam, poverty, racism, children starving while rich men get richer. People dying for no reason other than they were born the wrong color, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Where's God in all that? Marvin didn't have an answer. The comfortable certainties his father had beaten into him suddenly felt fragile, inadequate, like children's toys in the hands of an adult who had seen too much of the world to believe in simple explanations anymore. But he wasn't ready to voice his doubts. Not yet. That courage would come later, in the worst possible moment. October 14th, 1967, Hampton, Sydney College, Virginia. Marvin watched Tammy collapse in his arms during a performance of Ain't No Mountain High Enough. One moment she was singing about love conquering all obstacles. The next moment she was falling, her body going limp, her eyes rolling back. Brain tumor, the doctor said. Surgery, they said. Hope, they said. But Marvin saw something else in the hospital that night. He saw the first crack in his faith. If God was all-powerful, if God was all-loving, if God really had a plan for everyone's life, why would he let this happen to Tammy? She was good, pure in ways that Marvin knew he wasn't. She didn't deserve this. She deserved healing, not suffering. She deserved a long life filled with music and laughter and all the love she had to give. For 32 months, Marvin watched Tammy die by degrees. 8 surgeries that left her weaker each time. Countless chemotherapy sessions that stole her hair, her energy, her ability to sing with the power that had made her famous. Each treatment stealing a little more of her light until there was barely anything left but a fragile shell of the woman who had once made him believe the world could be beautiful. And through it all, Marvin prayed, begged, bargained with a God who seemed to have stopped listening, or maybe had never been listening at all. Take me instead, he whispered in hospital chapels across the country, kneeling on floors that had been worn smooth by the knees of other desperate people. She's innocent. I'm the sinner. She never hurt anyone. Take me. But God took Tammy anyway, slowly, cruelly, in a way that made Marvin question everything he had ever believed about divine mercy. March 16th, 1970. The phone call came at 4:23 in the afternoon. Marvin was at Hitsville, sitting in the same studio where he and Tammy had recorded Ain't No Mountain High Enough and Your Precious Love and all the other songs that had convinced the world they were perfect together. The same room where she'd laughed at his jokes, where she'd sung about love conquering all obstacles, where she'd made him believe, however briefly, that maybe his father had been wrong about him. Now she was gone, and the questions that had been building in Marvin's chest for 3 years exploded outward like a dam bursting, flooding his mind with doubt and rage and a kind of spiritual vertigo that made him feel like he was falling through space. He drove to the house of God in a daze, muscle memory guiding him to the place where his faith had been born. But when he walked through those doors, when he knelt at that altar, something fundamental broke inside him. Answer me, Marvin screamed into the empty church. Where were you when she needed you? Where are you now? What kind of God lets a 24-year-old girl die while letting bastards like my father live to torment their children? The silence was deafening, complete, just emptiness where God's voice should have been. That night marked the beginning of the most important creative period of Marvin's life. Because in losing his faith, he found something else. The courage to question everything. The freedom to examine his life and his world without the filter of prescribed beliefs. The permission to be angry at God or at the absence of God without fearing eternal punishment. For months after Tammy's death, Marvin refused to perform, couldn't sing love songs when love had been ripped away from him so cruelly, couldn't pretend everything was fine when the foundations of his world had crumbled and left him standing in the rubble of his childhood beliefs. Berry Gordy pressured him to return to the studio, to give the people what they wanted: smooth, romantic Marvin Gaye singing about hearts and flowers and happily ever after. The Motown machine needed product. The fans needed reassurance. The bottom line needed protection. But Marvin was done with fairy tales, done with pretending that love conquered all when he had watched love die slowly in a hospital bed, done with singing about God's goodness when God had remained silent while an innocent woman suffered. Instead, he started asking questions. Real questions. Dangerous questions. The kind his father had taught him were blasphemous, but that felt more honest than any prayer he had ever prayed. What's going on in this world? Why is there so much pain? Why do the innocent suffer while the guilty prosper? Why do children die while their murderers live? Why does God, if there is a God, allow such cruelty to flourish? The album that emerged from this spiritual crisis was unlike anything Motown had ever released. What's going on was Marvin's letter to God, his formal complaint filed against the universe. But it was also something more profound, proof that faith and doubt could coexist, that questioning God might be the most honest form of worship available to thinking people. "Mother, mother, there's too many of you crying," Marvin sang, his voice carrying all the pain of watching Tammy die slowly, all the confusion of a man whose prayers had gone unanswered. "Brother, brother, brother, there's far too many of you dying." These weren't protest songs in the traditional sense. They were prayers, desperate, angry prayers from a man who still believed in God just enough to argue with him. Songs that dared to suggest that maybe God needed to answer some questions before receiving any more praise. The title track began with party chatter, laughter, the sound of people trying to ignore the darkness closing in around them. But underneath all that forced merriment, Marvin's voice cut through the noise with surgical precision. "What's going on?" It was the question that had been destroying him since Tammy's collapse. The question his father had forbidden him to ask. The question that contained all his rage, all his confusion, all his desperate hope that somewhere in the chaos, there might be meaning. There might be purpose. There might be someone listening who cared enough to explain why good people suffered while evil people thrived. When Berry Gordy first heard the album, he called it the most uncommercial thing Marvin had ever done. Too political, too heavy, too real for radio, too dangerous for Motown's carefully constructed image as purveyors of uplifting entertainment. But Marvin knew it was the truest thing he'd ever created. For the first time in his career, he wasn't singing for the audience. He wasn't singing for Motown. He wasn't singing for his father or his critics or anyone else who might judge his work. He was singing to God, or to the silence where God should have been. And in those songs, "What's Happening, Brother?" "Save the Children," "Inner City Blues," "Make Me Wanna Holler," Marvin found a new kind of faith. Not the blind obedience his father had demanded, but something more complex, more honest. A faith big enough to contain doubt, strong enough to survive questions, brave enough to demand answers from heaven. The album became a masterpiece, proof that spiritual music didn't have to be comfortable or safe. Sometimes the most powerful prayers were the angry ones. Sometimes questioning God was the only way to find him. Sometimes faith required doubt as its foundation. But artistic success couldn't fill the void Tammy's death had created. Critical acclaim couldn't silence the voices that whispered in the dark. Commercial vindication couldn't resurrect the friend whose death had started this whole spiritual collapse. And doubt, once awakened, is hard to silence. As the 1970s progressed, Marvin's spiritual crisis deepened rather than resolved. The cocaine use escalated from recreational to necessary, from weekend indulgence to daily requirement. The paranoia grew from mild suspicion to overwhelming certainty that enemies surrounded him on every side. The questions multiplied without answers, breeding in the silence where God's voice should have been. He recorded "Let's Get It On" in 1973, a celebration of sexual desire that his father called devil music, and banned from the house. But for Marvin, it was another kind of prayer, a desperate search for connection, for transcendence, for something to fill the God-shaped hole in his chest. I've been really trying, baby, trying to hold back this feeling for so long. He sang with a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. But what was he really trying to hold back? Lust, or the growing certainty that he was completely, utterly alone in a universe that didn't care whether he lived or died. The irony was crushing. The more successful Marvin became, the more empty he felt. Millions of fans loved his music, but no one really knew him. He could fill stadiums with his voice, but couldn't fill the silence in his own heart. He could make other people feel less alone while feeling more isolated than ever. By 1982, when Marvin recorded Sexual Healing in Exile in Belgium, hiding from the IRS and his ex-wives and the wreckage of his American life, the questions had become overwhelming. The album was simultaneously his most carnal and most spiritual work. Songs about physical desire that carried undertones of desperate spiritual longing. Get up, get up, get up, get up, let's make love tonight, he sang over a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere primal. But beneath the seductive groove was the voice of a man who had been asking God for healing his entire life and still hadn't received an answer. The closest Marvin came to finding peace was in performance. Those transcendent moments when his voice soared above the pain, above the doubt, above the crushing weight of unanswered questions. On stage, singing to thousands of people who hung on every note, he could almost convince himself that he wasn't alone, that his voice mattered, that someone was listening. But those moments never lasted, and in the quiet afterward, backstage in empty dressing rooms that smelled of sweat and desperation, the questions always returned with renewed force. April 1st, 1984. The day before Marvin's 45th birthday, in his childhood bedroom at 2101 South Gramercy Place in Los Angeles, surrounded by the same religious iconography his father had used to terrorize him as a child, Marvin Gaye faced the final silence. The gunshot that killed him came from his father's hand, but the wound had been festering for 14 years, since that night in the house of God, when Marvin knelt at the altar and asked questions that God, or the silence where God should have been, refused to answer. In death, Marvin became what he had been searching for his entire life, a voice crying out in the wilderness, asking the questions that others were afraid to ask. His music lived on as a testament to the struggle between faith and doubt, proof that the most honest prayers often contain more questions than answers. The songs remain. The questions remain. The silence continues. But sometimes late at night, when What's Going On plays softly in the darkness and Marvin's voice rises like smoke toward heaven, you can almost hear God listening. Almost hear him preparing an answer to the questions Marvin Gaye spent his life asking. Almost.